Hello, everyone. This is The Sexual Catholic, and I'm your host, Dr. Mark Levand. If you're interested in broadening your understanding of sexuality and/or the sexuality-Catholicism connection, you're in the right place. Thanks for being here today. Let's get into the episode. Welcome to this episode of The Sexual Catholic. I'm your host, Dr. Mark Levand, and today we're going to talk a bit about how sexology and theology agree on the importance of sexuality. And we're going to look at a model for understanding sexuality a little more broadly than you may be used to. And then some key concepts in Catholic theology that support healthy sexuality. So the concept that sexuality is holistic, an integral part of the human person, is believed across the board by sexologists and theologians alike. You maybe have heard the word sexologist before. A sexologist is someone who studies sexuality, right? And because sexuality is an interdisciplinary field that can encompass a lot of different people. But what I'm going to be pulling from is largely the fields of the helping professions in human sexuality, education, therapy, and the way that we examine how to help people with sexuality. So let's start this episode with some of these quotes so that you know that I'm not just making this stuff up. And then we'll talk about a useful model in the field called the circles of sexuality. And then we will get into the Catholic teaching. So, there's several official groups of sexologists that really endorse this concept that sexuality is a central part of the human person. The World Association of Sexual Health talks about this and upholds that, quote, sexuality is a central aspect of being human throughout life. ASECT, the American Association of Sexuality Educators, Counselors, and Therapists, talk about sexuality as inherent, essential, and a beneficial dimension of being human. SIECUS, or what used to be known as the Sexuality Information and Education Council of the U.S., it is now rebranded as SIECUS, Sex Ed for Social Change. They have talked about sexuality as a fundamental part of being human, one worthy of dignity and respect. And I think that's a really telling concept about how meaningful sexuality is to people. Because now let's shift our understanding to what does the Church say about sexuality? And we see in the Catechism of the Catholic Church is like a book that people flip to see, like, what does the Church teach about this? And very similarly to all those sexology organizations, the Catechism says all aspect of the human person in the unity of body and soul, this is from Catechism number 2332, and affirms that sexuality is a source of joy and pleasure. That's from 2362. That sexuality is a source of joy and pleasure. And there have been church teachings throughout history that have also mentioned this. In recent history, recent for the world of social science and recent for the world of theology are very different. In theology, recent can be the last 100 years, where in social science, recent is more like the last 10 years, maybe. If it's 15, you're kind of stretching it. But there was a document called Persona Humana, or on the human person, in 1975. And it had the recognition of the usefulness of research in this regard, where it says, quote, according to contemporary scientific research, the human person is so profoundly affected by sexuality that it must be considered as one of the factors which gives to each individual's life the principal traits that distinguish it. End quote. Noting that we're looking at scientific research, and it's, sexuality profoundly affects us very deeply, and it's a principal trait which is really, really meaningful. John Paul II, in 1981, talked in Familiaris Consortio, affirmed that sexuality is by no means something purely biological, but concerns the innermost being of the human person, end quote. John Paul II continues on to note the church's mission of, quote, presenting sexuality as a value and task of the whole person, end quote, meaning that it's not just a single aspect of a human person. And when we try to single out an aspect of sexuality or diminish people to just one aspect of their identity by doing this, to make it something about their sexuality, that would be incongruent with Catholic teaching. Lastly, we hear from the Sacred Congregation for Catholic Education in 1983 in a document called Educational Guidance in Human Love that, quote, sexuality is a fundamental component of personality, one of its modes of being, of manifestation, of communicating with others, of feeling, of expressing, and of living human love. Therefore, it's an integral part of the development of the personality and of its educative process, end quote. That means that our sexuality is not only integral part of our humanity and our development and our personality, but that we should learn about it, that we should be learning about sexuality. With this in mind, the fact that sexuality is super important for sexologists, sex educators, and the Catholic Church alike, let's take a look at a model that we use in sex ed. I like to use it a lot. A lot of my colleagues also use this to help people understand concepts in sexuality that might be seemingly overwhelming, but it helps make it digestible. This model is called the circles of sexuality, and it helps us understand how broad the concept of sexuality really is. And then we'll look at some positive things that Catholicism has to say about it. Okay, so imagine a circle of 5 circles. You can Google an image to help if you want. If you just Google circles of sexuality, I'm sure it will come up. But the circles are if you were to take the Olympic symbol, right, and take it one hand in the right and one in the left, and then loop it together as a circle, that's kind of what this looks like. And each of these circles is a different area of sexuality. One circle is called the circle of sensuality. We have the circle of intimacy, the circle of sexual identity, the circle of sexual and reproductive health, and then the circle of sexualization. I'll talk a little bit about each of these to broaden our understanding of what the term sexuality really entails. This model was developed by sexologist Dennis Daly, originally in 1981, and has undergone changes and developments since. So let's start with that circle of sensuality. This circle is defined as the physiological and psychological pleasures we get from our own body and the bodies of others. This means our senses, right? What we can hear, see, taste. Sexual pleasure that we experience, body orgasms and body sensations, all fall into this. Then there's this concept called skin hunger, one of my favorite concepts from the circles of sexuality, which is the level that we like to be touched, right? Some people have high levels of skin hunger and some have low levels of skin hunger. And it's not just touched sexually, but just touching at all in a caring, human, connecting way. Holding hands, giving a hug, sitting next to each other on the couch, touching legs, right? Doesn't have to be sexual, but some people are just more touchy people than others. You'll see this when you see people who are like, I'm a hugger, and then you got those people who are like, I'm really not, right? Some people, lower levels of skin hunger. And that's a really good way for partners to be able to talk about how much they like to be touched or not. Another aspect that falls into this circle of sensuality is fantasy, sexual fantasies, the psychological pleasures that we get, right? And another aspect is body image, how we view our bodies and the way that our bodies exist in the world. in a sensuous way, in a sensual way, through our senses, right? Again, this doesn't have to be sexual, but our relationship with our body is related to our sexuality. And then we have the circle of intimacy, which is the experience of emotional closeness to others and having it returned. This is things like sharing, right? Liking and loving, right? Those L words, the feelings that we have. I feel a little good about, when that person smiled at me, right? Those feelings of liking and loving. Vulnerability and risk-taking and trust. These are all components that we navigate with our sexuality, with our relationships. And a colleague of mine, Dr. Steph Shando, also included in here self-disclosure, how we disclose to others about ourselves, right? That's part of that vulnerability. And she also included self-acceptance and self-love. Because, quite frankly, loving others is really important. But you know what? Loving ourselves. Because sometimes we all don't have the best, what we call internal, self-talk. And we have pretty negative self-talk. And we might talk to ourselves in ways that if we heard someone talk to our friend that way, we'd be like, excuse me, that's my friend. And so consider self-acceptance and self-love too. And then communication, how we communicate with others. This is part of intimacy, right? Vulnerability, communicating our feelings, communicating our needs and our wants, really important for sexuality. And then we have the circle of sexual identity. This is a sense of who we are as a sexual person. This includes, sexual orientation and our gender identity, how we live in the world with gender, and also our experience of gender roles. What does the world say about people of my gender and how we should act and behave? And how do I feel about those? Do those fit or do those not fit? We also have what's called biological sex or sex assigned at birth, right? Because a lot of people think biological sex is really just like a simple one thing. It actually has a lot of different components that go into it. And when we talk about sex assigned at birth, it's really just when a baby is born, people say, I'm seeing these types of genitals. This is what sex your baby is. But we didn't necessarily run a karyotype test, right, to see if that person has XX or XY genes. And so sometimes this is also termed sex traits, or the things that we have inside and about our bodies that relate to our sex or our biological sex. And then lastly, in this circle of sexual identity, we have relationship and behavior labels that we pick. Right? People's sexual identity, they can say, I'm gay, or I'm straight, or I'm bisexual, or sometimes pansexual, meaning that, gender may not be a factor in how someone might be sexually attracted to someone. But in our relationship and behavior labels, we also have people who say, right, I'm a celibate person. I don't have sex. We'll talk about celibacy and chastity much later on in this series because those are theological terms that then have real-life sexuality world implications, but we'll come back to that. Or people who say they're kinky, right? People identify as kinky people. Other people would say I'm monogamous or polyamorous, right? People will use language to describe how they are as sexual beings in the world. This is part of their sexual identity. Then we have the circle of sexual and reproductive health. These are the facts and figures of, anatomy and physiology, right? When someone says sex ed, this is usually what they're thinking of. But when we talk about sexuality education, it's actually much more than just what's the anatomy, what's the physiology, how does it work? But in this circle of sexual and reproductive health, we also have things like STIs, or what are currently called sexually transmitted infections. You may have formerly heard of them as STDs, sexually transmitted diseases, formerly known as VD or venereal disease, and formerly known as sin. This is a really big concept. Even in our medical literature, up to the 1920s, we have doctors saying, yeah, we need to stop looking at infections as sin-based and judgment, because that's not helpful to our medical conversation. There's a book, Syphilis of the Innocent, from 1922 that talks about that. Anyways, contraception, how people are trying to avoid conception, or people who are trying to conceive, right? How conception works. The sexual behaviors that people do, right? We talked about sexual behaviors and having a label, like we talked about kinky in the last circle. But sexual behaviors, are they safe? Are we doing them as safe as we can? Are there other ways to do these sexual behaviors that might help protect ourselves and others around us? Also within this circle of sexual and reproductive health is pregnancy, abortion, and birth. What are the types of things that happen in each of those scenarios? Learning about those is really important and good for understanding how we as humans exist in the world. And there's also this concept of sexual growth and development. What is, appropriate sexual development and sexual growth, how people grow? What is normal, right? That's a big question. Dr. Emily Nagoski talks a lot about this. She runs the podcast Come As You Are, talks about it in a book as well. But sexual growth and development falls under this sexual and reproductive health circle. And lastly, sexual difficulties, right? There's understanding how we function as sexual beings, but also if we're maybe not doing it in ways that we want to be doing it. What if we're having difficulties? How do we talk about that? What do we do about them? What do those difficulties look like? This is important because for some people, they're taught that sexual difficulties are just a fact of life and that they're insurmountable. But there are ways that we can do things about them, right, and talk about them in different ways. And lastly, in our circles of sexuality, we talked about sensuality. We talked about intimacy. We talked about sexual identity. We talked about sexual and reproductive health. And now we're on the circle of sexualization. And this is the use of sexuality to manipulate and control others. And many people, when they hear this, the first thing they think is usually rape or sexual coercion, right? Coercion is forcing people to do things that they don't want to do. Or sexual assault or sexual harassment. And that is true. All of those do fall into this circle. But there are also different ways that we try to use our sexuality to manipulate others. Manipulate gets a lot of a bad rap. But look at flirtation, right? When we flirt with people, we might smile, try to get them to like us, right? And we do that because, well, we want someone to like us, right? So there are things that people do to try and influence that. Flirtation and seduction, right? Trying to get someone sexually aroused to have sex with them. That is also another aspect of trying to influence others. Also, the concept of commodifying sex, like when people withhold sex, usually with the older married couples that I'll work with, usually in heterosexual marriages. They might have this conversation like, well, unless you do the dishes, there's no sex tonight, right? That's called withholding sex. And that is, a type of manipulation or control. And then, of course, advertising and the media, right? When we see ads about sex, we get that saying, sex sells. And so people try and grab attention with different types of sexual imagery. Okay, so we have all of those circles, right? The circle of sensuality, the circle of intimacy, the circle of sexual identity, the circle of sexual and reproductive health, and the circle of sexualization. And all of these circles exist with our values laden throughout. We each have values ascribed to each of these things in every one of these circles. And there's also a meaningful influence of power that people can use or exploit in each one of these levels of sexuality. And all of these circles exist in a larger circle of culture, because each of these things changes based on our own cultural experience. Holding hands in public may be considered intimate or a PDA, public display of affection, in one culture, but not at all in another. Physical space boundaries vary by culture. Gender roles, what's appropriate for people assigned male or assigned female at birth, or people who don't fit into either one of those boxes, right? Those vary by culture as well. And all of these things influence who we are as a sexual person. So, the circles of sexuality. This is an understanding of sexuality pretty broadly. Some people will use the word sexuality to mean sexual orientation. And they're like, hey, what's your sexuality? And then you're like, well, there's a lot that goes into it. What is it you're asking about, right? They really mean sexual orientation, or maybe gender identity. But the fact of the matter is that sexuality encompasses so many different things. So let's look at some good things that the Catholic Church has to offer about this. Now, you may have been taught some harmful things about sexuality by members of the church or Catholic family members, right? That sex is bad, it's dirty, the body is bad, but the soul is good. And if you've been taught that, I'm sorry. That's not the case. That's not true, and that's not what the Catholic Church teaches. And those thoughts don't serve us or those we love any more than other harmful thoughts about who we are, right? And you can think of the things that people think harmfully about themselves and others, right? Not helpful things. So if you imagine that all of those harmful messages are filling up a cup, some mental cup, right? Sex is bad, dirty, the body's bad, soul is good, right? Take that mental cup and just dump it down the mental drain. We don't need those. Those are not helpful. Those aren't serving us, and so let them go. Now set that cup back up, and let's fill it with some more positive concepts. Okay. In the Catholic faith, we have an understanding that the our bodies, human bodies, are good. This is what we call the Imago Dei, or that we're made in the image and likeness of God. You've probably heard this a lot. And this means that we have the capacity for love and bringing love into the world. The image of God, sure, like we have, bodies and we are imprinted as loving beings into this world. And another aspect of the Catholic Church teaching on sexuality is that sex has two purposes, right? People have heard a lot that sex is only for procreation, but the Catholic Church does not teach that. It does teach that sex is for procreation, but it says that courtesy of Vatican II, specifically Gaudium et Spes, we hear that sex is procreative and unitive. A unitive aspect of our sexuality and us as sexual beings that has gone under discussed for centuries. And this lack of discussion has led to problems with our understanding of sexuality. Problems of the condemnation of non-procreative sex, even if it's unitive, expressing joy, love, happiness between humans. This lack of focus on the unitive nature of sexuality has also robbed many people of a sense of integration of our sexual selves into who we are as loved humans in the world. It's robbed many people of the ability to integrate who we are as sexual beings and who we are as loved humans in the world. So how can this look different? Well, let's look at some of these teachings rooted in the goodness and mystery of God. And we'll get this lens through which we can understand sexuality in perhaps a different way than we've been taught. So, some of these key foundations. Imago Dei, right? Made in the image of God. We talked about that. We also have this concept of human dignity. We all have inalienable, inviolable, you can't violate it. You can't get rid of it. You can't undo it, no matter what you do. Human dignity. You have human dignity just from being humans. Again, thank you, Second Vatican Council. I might have said this before. Vatican II, you might hear me say Vatican II, documents from the Second Vatican Council. The church throughout history will have like big councils where all the bishops come together and they're like, guys, we really got to talk about this. And one of the most important ones in recent history, remember recent 100 years, was in the 1960s. And that was called Vatican II, or the Second Vatican Council. And it created a bunch of different documents that helped us understand and better articulate what the Catholic Church teaches or believes. And one of the things is that a lot of people who claim to be Catholic and claim to, even those who teach Catholicism, might not know what went on in that in that council. And this is one of those things that came from that council. We all have inviolable human dignity. We cannot get rid of the dignity we get from being human, no matter what you do, right? There's a book by a guy named John Randy Sachs. He's a Jesuit, called A Christian Vision of Humanity. It's a really good book that is, I think it's like 90 pages or something. It's not really big, but he does a really good job of explaining that. Okay, so we have Imago Dei, we have human dignity. We also have this concept that we are inspirited bodies or embodied spirits. Based in the theology of Karl Rahner, theologian from last century. And sexual theologians still talk about this very frequently, like Sister Margaret Farley. She wrote a book called Just Love about sexual ethics. But this concept that we are humans that are body and soul together. It's not split. It's not like our body's bad, right? So if people practice self-mortification, or, harming the body because they're like, my body's bad, or self-flagellation. You might have heard this term. I think it was in that movie. What was that? The Da Vinci Code, right? The dude's like, putting clamps on his leg and like whipping himself in the back. No. If you are punishing your body for being a body, that is not Catholic. That is against the concept that we are in bodies that are made good. Made good by God. So, Imago Dei, human dignity, inspirited bodies, embodied spirits. We also have right relationship. Right relationship is this concept in Catholic teaching about creating relationships that invite love into them, or what's oftentimes looked at as choosing love when we have this choice. It's either choose love or not love, and the answer is usually choose love. That's how we create right relationships, right? It's simple. It's easier said than done, obviously. But it's an easy concept, right? We want to create right relationships. We want to be in right relationships with others. And then there's this concept of co-creativity. This is one of my favorites, and I remember first learning about it, how meaningful it was. To me and those in my class as well. One of the things that we get from that likeness of God is this. We can create. We work in co-creativity with God. We can create, not only reproducing other humans, right? Not everyone can do that, right? But humanity can reproduce humanity. But we have a creative power in our own relationships. The power to create and bring rightness in relationships. That is literally our God-given power, right? We have the power to make people happy, to bring joy, to form better and stronger relationships with another person through our communication and our love. We have this co-creative ability. Super cool. Definitely Catholic teaching. Okay. These things whenever we do this, whenever we do like co-creativity in order to who are we co-creating with, right? We're co-creating with God, right? Whenever we bring good things into the world, that is working in cooperation with God. And another way of looking at that is called working in cooperation with grace, or God offering God's self to us at all times, right? Pick me, choose love, choose me, choose, right? Which, quite frankly, can be really annoying when it comes from religious people who then shame you for not picking love here or there. Like, if you're one of those people, I hear you, but don't do that. We're all trying our best out there, right? So maybe, offer grace and patience in that. But we have this concept of working in cooperation with grace. So, all right. Now, how can we understand all of this when it comes to sexuality? What does that mean? Okay. Sexuality is good and a multifaceted way for us to experience God in the world. Remember, in each of those circles, right? In each of the different subcategories in each of those circles, not just in sexual acts, right? A lot of church writing about sexuality might talk about sexual activity, but there's also this concept that no, it's not just sexual acts. There's lots, right? Our sexuality, given the understanding of the teachings above, our sexuality is a landscape through which we can choose God through unity and pleasure, right? We can bring God into the world through our relationships with others. We can choose love in the world through our sexuality. We'll do an episode on pleasure later, but the short version is that sexual pleasure is a good thing. It's a theologically good thing, and it's a morally good thing. Don't be afraid of sexual pleasure. Again, we're going to get more into that later. But this is a really important concept for what we have here. So let's recap. Sexuality is multifaceted, right? All those circles. It is good because we, humans, are fundamentally good. We're made in the image and likeness of God, and that gives us the power to form good relationships in the world, to form right relationships in the world. Whenever we look at sexuality topics to be like, is this like a good or bad thing, right? Because, of course, people can do bad things with sexuality, right? I'm not saying that no, all things about sexuality. No, people can do bad things with sexuality. We can do bad things with anything. We can do bad things with our hands. We can build a house or deliver food to the homeless. Or we can, hurt someone, beat someone up. We can do bad things with our 2006 Toyota Corolla, right? We can give someone a ride to the hospital, or we can run someone over, right? I do not advocate, don't run anyone over. I am a firm believer in right relationships, and running someone over does not make a good relationship, usually. Don't do that. Okay, but none of them get the same bad rap as sexuality, right? If we are doing bad things with our hands or bad things with our Toyota Corollas, it doesn't have the same historical shame and condemnation that sexuality does. But when we look at sexuality as being good, we should consider the positive Catholic lenses. We're made in the image of God. We have inviolable human dignity. We are inspirited bodies or embodied spirits, and that's good. We form right relationships, and we have the power to form them. We recognize our co-creative power, that we can create good relationships with God and others, working in cooperation with grace, exercising our power and autonomy to choose, or to simplify that lens. Right relationship and co-creatorship is working in cooperation with grace. And that, my friends, is a route to sexual health and sexual integration. These are going to be the principles we consider in other aspects of sexuality that we'll examine later in this series. This episode was pretty heavily theological, and we need that to lay a groundwork for understanding what we're going to be talking about moving forward. So join me for the next episode where we talk about what constitutes a sexually healthy adult. thank you all for listening to this episode. If you liked what you heard or otherwise appreciated it, please subscribe and rate the podcast. If you have other thoughts or ideas for future episodes you'd like to share, please email thesexualcatholic@gmail.com. If you or someone you know would like to learn more about the work that I do, for more information, please visit www.marklevand.com. Thank you for tuning in. I hope something in today's episode was helpful, interesting, or otherwise inspiring. Have a great day.